Now, Bruce, that's what I call a fireplace.
Isn't this magnificent? I mean, this is a tremendous fireplace.
I think it's a little inefficient, though. What do you think Count Rumford would say?
Count Rumford would say we wasted a lot of rocks here. We could have done something a little bit more efficient. But, I mean, what a wonderful welcome coming into here on a winter's night and having a roaring fire going. It would have been great.
That's true.
Yeah.
Now, as a historian of the arts and crafts period, what can you tell me about this building and all the furnishings that are in it?
Well, the Grove Park Inn was built in 1913, which was, as you know, the height of the arts and crafts movement. So it was only natural that they'd want to furnish it with what some people call mission oak furniture, more appropriately, arts and crafts furniture. Now, you would have thought maybe they'd go to Gustav Stickley or L&J.G. Stickley, but instead they went to the Roycrofters. And the Roycrofters were just a band of craftsmen up in East Aurora, New York, but they made fantastic furniture.
So what can you show me that people might be interested in building?
Not surprised at all. Arts and crafts is hot again. And here's why. I mean, this is a wonderful piece here. This is a Limbert bookcase. It's got a great overhang on it. And I love these brackets, which we refer to as corbels in the arts and crafts terminology.
Now, this is quartersawn white oak, which is very traditional.
Right? And this piece is fumed very dark. And you hear a lot about fumed oak. But not all arts and crafts pieces were this dark. You can, if you're making your own, or if you're refinishing one, you have the option of making them a little bit lighter than this.
I see you have a clock over here.
Talk
This
about
is kind of unusual.
Yeah. This was custom made by the Roycrofters for the general manager here in 1913. And the Roycrofters were always great about leaving their mark right in the middle. They wanted to make sure you knew that the Roycrofters made this piece. But to their credit, they should be very proud of this. I mean, it's a great arts and crafts piece.
Now, what about the inscription here?
Well, the arts and crafts movement were big on mottos and slogans, and they would, many times that they would paint them on, or in this case, they carved it, and it actually becomes part of the decoration, just like the hand-hammered hardware we find on there, too.
Again, it's quartersawn oak. Can we reproduce a finish? How can we do that today?
We can. Originally, they would have been using aniline dyes and shellac, and those both can be a little tricky to work with. But you can duplicate this with oil-based stains and satin polyurethanes and get just as good of a finish.
Great. What else you got to show me?
Well, got one more.
You know, Bruce, what I really like about this place is that the guests get to really appreciate this furniture. They can sit in the chairs, they can get up close to the pieces, they're not hidden away.
No, and Norm, it's amazing. You'd be surprised at how many times people are sitting in an antique, they have no idea how valuable it is. To them, it's a place to have a cup of coffee and read their paper. So, and this is the piece I wanted to show you.
Oh, that's great. What would you call this?
This is a hall seat, and it probably had its origins in the Victorian era, but it lends itself well to the arts and crafts period as well.
More quartersawn oak, and that's beautifully book-matched, these panels.
Yeah, the craftsmen during the arts and crafts period really did take the time to do things like that, and it makes it a nice functional piece, straight lines, and also a little hidden surprise here, we get a practical function as well.
Put some stored things here, or even throw your boots in there.
Throw your boots in there afterwards, right. So the arts and crafts are practical at the same time.
Now, it looks like they've made a repair on this armrest. I can see where that could be a problem. This grain is pretty fragile.
Right. I think if somebody leaned back hard enough there, that'd be the weak link in our chain here that could break.
Well, I think I might be able to come up with a way to fix that. I could run a tenon through here before I assemble it, or I could inlay a piece of plywood underneath, and that would give it a lot of strength.
Yeah, I think you can find a way to improve upon their design, even though it's been around for 80 years. You can probably do a little bit better.
I also like the fact that the finish is a little bit lighter.
Right.
But it's a great size.
Yeah.
I think you've found us a piece for the workshop.
Oh, great.
Thanks.
Great. That's great to hear.
Do you think they'd mind if I took a couple pictures and measured it up?
Don't think so. I think they'd be honored.
All right. Well, keep looking for some other projects for us.
All right.
Well, good morning. It's a little damp today here in New England, so it's a great day to be in the shop building our version of the hall seat that we saw in North Carolina. I want to start today by working on the back of this seat. There are two vertical pieces and then these horizontal pieces which have tenons that fit into mortises. There's a pair of mortises here, a pair in the middle, and long mortises down below for the panel that actually makes the back of the storage compartment. So over here on the workbench, I've set up those two side pieces and laid out for the mortises. I'm going to make the mortises with my router. I have a rib fence, or a guide fence, and a 3/8 inch straight cutting bit. Now when you make mortises with a router, there's several things that can go wrong. First, the fence can move away from the work. That happens especially when you go in the wrong direction. If I go forward, the rotation of the bit wants to pull the router along. It makes it very hard to control. If I pull it towards myself, the rotation of the bit will pull the fence against the work, and I have much more control. The other thing that can happen is that on narrow stock, the router base can rock, which would angle the mortise and throw it off center. By clamping two pieces together, I have a wider place for the base and, again, much more control. The key is to make the mortise slowly, taking a little bit with each pass. Now, before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. And of course, hearing protection when necessary. I've changed the depth of plunge on my router from 3/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch to make a groove between this lower mortise and this mid mortise for the solid oak panels. When you route a mortise, you end up with a rounded end. There are two options, either round the tenon or square up the mortise. I'm choosing to square up the mortise. Let's look again at our prototype. When you're seated in it and you're resting on it, there's a lot of downward pressure on this armrest piece. At the front, it's supported by the leg. But at the back, what I did is I made a notch in the back panel. That way, part of it is sitting in that notch, giving it strength. I'll make the notch at the table saw. And I'm going to make the notch by nibbling away the material using my miter gauge and a single saw blade. I'll make a pass through and then make successive passes until the notch is formed. The next step is to make grooves in this center rail, the center stile, and this lower rail to receive the wood panels. Over here at the table saw, I've set up a feather board, which you saw me make on an earlier program. What that does is it keeps the stock tightly up against the fence as I run it through my dado cutter. I don't want it to move away as I make that groove. This is the center rail for that backrest piece. I need tenons on each end of this piece as well as the lower panel. To make the tenons, I've attached a sacrificial strip to my rip fence, set the dado for 3/4 of an inch width and a 1/4 inch height. I'll just run them through. With that setup, I've just made a short tenon on each end of that center stile. This notch at the lower edge of the tenons of that bottom panel will allow it to fit into the mortise properly. Okay, now that's the top rail of that back panel, and that too has a notch in the tenon so that it fits into the mortise properly. The last machining operation before I can assemble the back is to make this groove at the bottom edge of the lower stile. That'll receive the plywood from the storage compartment. Well, now I'm ready for some assembly, and I'm putting a coat of glue on the tenon and in the groove. I'm starting with the center stile and that center rail, and that's where this joint is. I'll slip these two together on my layout lines. Then the large bottom panel, and we'll clamp that up. The trick here is to get all the pieces glued up and clamped before the glue actually sets. Here are the wood panels for the back or field of the seat. I started out with a thicker piece of stock, ran it through my bandsaw to resaw it, then I jointed it and planed it. And what that does is when I open it up, it gives me a book-matched set of panels, the grain reflecting each other. Now these will slip into the grooves that I machined earlier, no glue. No glue, because if we freeze these panels into the grooves, they'll probably split with expansion and contraction. Generally, it's not a good idea to glue a big joint like this where the grain runs in opposite directions. The rail has it running one way, the stile the other way. What happens is wood wants to expand and contract across the grain more than it does along the grain. So if we glue the whole joint, it's either going to split this board or it's just going to break the joint away. Here I'm using quartersawn white oak, which expands and contracts very little across the grain. However, I still am going to leave about 3 or 4 inches of the joint unglued to allow for some movement. Okay, that's great. While that dries, we'll go ahead and make the front assembly. Let's look at the prototype again. The front legs are a bit unusual. I had a good photograph of the antique, so I made a pattern on a piece of poster board. Sort of curves down into a foot, this outside edge angles out, and this top section is slightly tapered up to the armrest. I'll use the template to lay out my blanks, and while this edge is nice and straight and the full length, I'm going to use that to guide my router and make mortises right in this area for that front rail of the storage compartment. To make the tapers on the leg, I'm going to use my homemade tapering jig. I can use my pattern as a tool to adjust the jig. I swing it out until I get the cut parallel with the miter gauge slot, and then I can lock it down. I now take my blank, place it against the jig, make sure the jig is against the fence, and slide it back till it hits the stop. Now I want to move the whole assembly over until I'm on the right-hand side of my layout line and lock the fence in place. Okay, good. I want this taper cut to stop right at this intersection. The table saw doesn't allow for a square cut, and I don't want to overcut. So what I did is I put a line on the table saw just behind the blade and another line on the edge of the blank. I want to stop when the two meet, then I won't overcut. And for this long taper, the technique is exactly the same. We'll complete all the rest of the cutting here at the bandsaw. I clean up any saw marks left by the bandsaw with the oscillating spindle sander. As we assemble the front panel work, more glue in the mortises, glue on the tenons of the front of the storage compartment, and they were formed the same way as I made the tenons for the back panel. And of course there's a groove near the lower edge for the plywood bottom. All right, we'll set that down to dry and go back to work on the backrest. With the back panel all sanded so the joints are nice and smooth, I'm beginning to plow out a mortise which will receive the sides of the storage compartment. Here are the side pieces for the storage compartment. I've formed tenons on the ends just as I did before and cut a little notch so that it fits properly in the mortise. I have one more to go, and then tomorrow morning we'll assemble our seat, make the armrest and the mirror with no problem. Well, good morning. I'm getting started here today working once again on the front leg assembly. And I'm attaching a couple cleats that have a groove just using some 1.5-inch screws. Now these cleats are necessary to connect the side rails to that front assembly. They'll just get glued into that groove. Here I've placed the back assembly on the workbench, and I'm putting glue in the mortises and on the tenons of the side rails. And we'll start to put the seat together. Okay, with both sides installed, I can now slip in this 1/2-inch plywood bottom, which has been notched to fit in the grooves. This plywood isn't very arts and crafts looking, so I'll give it a coat of paint later. All right, with some glue in those grooves of the cleats I installed earlier, I can slip the front assembly on and then clamp it all up. Now it's time to start working on the armrests. I have a template made out of poster board and I've traced the outline on my oak. I want to cut as much of this straight portion as possible at the table saw. So once again, I'm going to use my indicator mark on the table and I'll run the piece in only to this layout line. Now let's work on that problem we saw on the antique original. The armrest had split right along this area. With that straight grain, it's very possible for that to happen. So what I did is actually reinforce that area by inlaying a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. That strengthens the joint, and hopefully we won't have any problems with the armrest splitting. To inlay the plywood, I use my router, a collar system, and a small router bit. What you do is make a template, in this case out of 1/4-inch plywood, clamp it over the workpiece, and route out the material. Okay, that takes care of the mortise. Now let me show you how this inlay kit works. It's pretty ingenious. Here's a collar just like the one on the router. If I drop it into the template and then place a router bit through it, you can see that as I go along the edges of the template, it cuts the perimeter, and then by going back and forth, I remove the material that's in between. Now for the patch. I simply pop off this outer collar, and that gives me a collar that's 1/8 of an inch smaller all the way around. When I drop that in and place a router bit in it, I'm interested in getting the material that remains, so I stay tight up against the edge, go all the way around the perimeter, and that gives me a patch that's an exact match. Okay, there's the patch. Now I just sand the corners so they're a bit round and it'll be a perfect fit. All right, some glue both in the mortise and on the patch. You can see how nicely that's fitting in there. That's going to add a lot of strength to that intersection. Now let me show you how we join the armrest to the front leg. I simply made a mortise right on the underside. Here's our template once again, clamped to the armrest, and there's another cutout, and using that with a 5/8 inch collar and a 3/8 inch bit, I can make the mortise. All right, I've put some glue in the notches and in the mortise. Make sure it's seated properly. And then the first thing I want to do is put a screw right in from the back side. And then put a long 2 1/4 inch screw into that style. Of course, we'll cover this hole with a bung later. Now I've turned my attention to the hinged seat. I need a mortise both in the seat and the fixed portion for this butt hinge. I'm using a template that I made out of plywood with a little stop on it and the same collar and bit system I used earlier, and that makes it very easy to cut these mortises. Now to secure the seat to the frame, a couple screws through the top, and those will get plugged, and 3 screws through the back. Now for the mirror. It's a frame with a beveled mirror. The first thing I want to do is make a rabbet in all the frame pieces to receive the mirror. So I've set up the stacked dado with the sacrificial strip. I'll just run them through. If I pop off the plywood backer, we can see how this mirror frame goes together. Take the mirror out, and you can see that the corners are joined with these pocket screws, and they work great for a project like this. To cut the pockets, I'm using our benchtop pocket cutter. There's a router bit that comes up on the first pass, and then when I pull the lever forward, a drill bit comes out to make the hole for the screw. These joints are a cinch to assemble. You just use these pan head self-tapping screws and a little bit of glue. Now I'm just rounding over the inside and then the outside edge with this 3/8 inch radius round over bit. I've just made a rabbet all around the outside perimeter of the frame, and that allows it to sit inside this opening. Now we're ready to take it into the finishing room and put on some stain. For the last few minutes I've been applying some cherry stain to our piece, and now I'm just wiping off the excess. Now I know it sounds crazy to be putting cherry stain on an arts and crafts piece, but the suggestion came from Bruce Johnson. He said start with cherry stain, put that on. Once that's dry, go over it with dark walnut stain and wipe off the excess, and that's what it'll look like. Now once I get through both steps, I'll seal everything up with some satin polyurethane. Hooks work, and so does the mirror. This storage area is going to come in handy. Now, special thanks to Bruce Johnson for giving us the recipe for the finish on this piece. It gives it a really nice look. And also for introducing us to the nice folks at the Grove Park Inn. This piece is going to play nicely in the front hall at the Abram household.